The morning my husband slid a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table and told me our son wasn't mine, I was still holding a spatula covered in scrambled eggs, and I remember thinking, with a strange and terrible calm, that the eggs were going to burn while my entire life fell apart in front of me. He said the words so quietly, so gently, that for one confused second I thought he was joking, the way he used to joke when we were newlyweds and still laughed at everything. But his eyes weren't laughing. His eyes were cold, rehearsed, already somewhere else. And in that instant, standing in the kitchen where I had rocked my son to sleep 1,000 times, I understood that the man I had married had already decided, long before that morning, to destroy me. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the idea that people can fight back against injustice and still choose love over hatred, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that truth eventually rises to the surface, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community means everything to me, and every person who watches these stories with an open heart helps keep this channel alive. Now, let me tell you what happened to me, and to my son, and to the marriage I thought would last forever. My name is Rosalind Hartley, though most people who love me call me Roz, and for 11 years I was married to a man named Julian Ashcombe. When I met Julian, he was charming in the effortless way some men are charming, the kind of charm that makes you feel like you're the only interesting person in a crowded room. He worked in commercial real estate, wore his confidence like a tailored jacket, and had a laugh that used to make strangers turn their heads in restaurants. I was 26 when we married, working as a paralegal at a small firm downtown, saving money in a jar labeled, "Someday," for a house with a garden. Julian made me believe someday would come faster than I ever imagined, and for the first several years of our marriage, it did. We bought a house with a garden. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine advertisement for happiness. Our son, Theodore, whom we called Teddy from the day he was born, came into the world on a rainy Tuesday in April, red-faced and furious at being pulled into the cold air of the hospital room. I remember Julian crying when the nurse placed Teddy on my chest, real tears rolling down his face, and I remember thinking that no man who cried like that could ever stop loving the child in front of him. For the first 6 years of Teddy's life, Julian was, by every measure I could see, a devoted father. He coached Teddy's t-ball team even though he had never been particularly interested in sports before Teddy was born. He read him the same 3 picture books every night until the spines cracked and the pages softened at the corners. He built Teddy a treehouse in our backyard oak tree over the course of an entire summer, sanding the wood himself, refusing help from the contractor next door because he wanted to be able to tell Teddy, someday, that his father had built it with his own hands. It was around Teddy's 7th birthday that things began to shift, slowly and quietly, the way a house settles before anyone notices the cracks in the plaster. Julian started coming home later. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. He started looking at his phone the way a man looks at something he doesn't want you to see. I told myself it was stress from work, that the market had gotten more competitive, that men in their late 30s sometimes went through periods where they needed space to figure themselves out. I made excuses for him the way women who love deeply and trust completely often do, because the alternative, that the man I had built a family with was becoming someone else in front of me, was too frightening to sit with for very long. I found out about Vivian Caro the way most betrayed spouses find out about the other woman, by accident, through a careless mistake that the guilty party never intends to make. Julian left his laptop open on the kitchen counter one Saturday afternoon while Teddy and I were in the backyard picking blackberries from the bramble along the fence, and when I came inside to refill our water bottles, I saw an email thread that made the floor tilt beneath me. Vivian worked in the marketing department of the same real estate firm as Julian. She was 29, unmarried, and according to the messages I forced myself to read even as my hands shook, she had been involved with my husband for almost a year. The messages were affectionate in a way that made my stomach turn, full of inside jokes and plans for a future that apparently did not include Teddy or me. I confronted Julian that same evening, after Teddy had gone to bed, my voice barely steady as I set the laptop on the coffee table between us like evidence at a trial. I expected him to deny it, to beg for forgiveness, to cry the way he had cried in that hospital room 7 years earlier. Instead, Julian sat very still for a long moment, and then he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said that he wasn't sorry, not really, because for the first time in years he felt like himself again, and that he had been thinking for a while about what our life would look like if I wasn't in it. I remember asking him, my voice cracking, what that meant for Teddy, and Julian looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something calculating and distant, and said that Teddy would be fine, that children were resilient, that we would figure out the details later. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Teddy's doorway watching him breathe, his small chest rising and falling under a blanket covered in cartoon dinosaurs, and I made a promise to myself that whatever happened between Julian and me, I would protect my son with everything I had. I did not yet know how much that promise would be tested, or how far Julian was willing to go to win a fight I did not even know we were having. In the weeks that followed, Julian moved into a rental apartment across town, and we began the slow, painful process of separating our finances, our furniture, our shared calendar of Teddy's school events and doctor's appointments. I tried, at first, to keep things civil for Teddy's sake. I told myself that even if Julian had failed me as a husband, he could still be a good father, and that Teddy deserved to have both of us in his life without the poison of our resentment seeping into his childhood. I was naive enough to believe that Julian wanted the same thing. I did not yet understand that Vivian Caro had ambitions that extended well beyond simply dating a man going through a divorce, and I did not yet understand what Julian was capable of when he felt he had something to prove. The custody negotiations started reasonably enough. Julian's lawyer proposed a standard arrangement, alternating weeks, holidays split evenly, the kind of schedule that family courts approve every single day in every city in the country. I agreed to it without much argument, because I believed, foolishly, that Julian's love for Teddy was the one part of him that hadn't changed. But 3 months into our separation, everything shifted. Julian's lawyer, a sharp, humorless woman named Priscilla Vane, filed a motion requesting full custody, citing what she called newly discovered concerns about Teddy's paternity. I remember reading the court filing at my kitchen table with my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the paper steady, my mind racing backward through every year of Teddy's life, every ultrasound, every hospital bracelet, every moment I had held him as an infant and known, with the absolute certainty only a mother can have, that he was mine. The filing included a document that claimed to be the results of a private DNA paternity test, supposedly conducted using a sample of Teddy's hair that Julian said he had collected from Teddy's hairbrush without my knowledge, sent to a laboratory whose name I had never heard of before. The report stated, in clinical, bloodless language, that there was a 0% probability that Julian Ashcombe was the biological father of Theodore Ashcombe. I read those words over and over, feeling something inside me crack open, not because I believed them, but because I understood immediately what they meant for my life. Julian was not simply ending our marriage. He was trying to take my son away from me entirely, using a piece of paper as a weapon, and if the court believed that document, he would have grounds to argue that I had deceived him for 7 years, that I was an unfit and dishonest mother, that Teddy would be better off in Julian's custody with Vivian Caro stepping in to raise him. I want you, watching this story, to imagine what it feels like to hold a document that claims your own child is not yours, when you know with every fiber of your being that it is a lie. I want you to imagine the particular kind of fear that settles into your bones when you realize the person you once loved most in the world is willing to fabricate evidence, to weaponize science itself, just to win. That fear lived in my chest for weeks. I barely ate. I barely slept. I would stand outside Teddy's bedroom door at night, listening to him breathe, terrified that some judge somewhere, moved by a fraudulent piece of paper, would decide that my son belonged with a father who had lied to obtain him and a woman who barely knew him. My first call was to my older sister, Genevieve, who had always been the practical one in our family, the one who kept receipts and read contracts twice before signing anything. Genevieve drove 3 hours from her home in the countryside the same day I called her, arriving at my door with a suitcase and an expression of pure, protective fury that I will never forget. She sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table where Julian had once slid that folded paper toward me, and she said something that I have held on to every single day since. She said that the truth does not need permission to exist, and that all we had to do was find a way to prove it, no matter how long it took or how expensive it became. Genevieve helped me find a family law attorney named Eleanor Whitcomb, a woman in her early 50s with silver hair cropped close to her head and a reputation, according to the reviews Genevieve had researched late into the night, for taking on cases that other lawyers considered too difficult or too costly to win. Eleanor's office was on the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, and when I sat across from her desk for the first time, shaking, exhausted, holding a manila folder with the falsified DNA report inside it, she read through the document slowly and carefully before looking up at me with an expression that was neither pity nor disbelief, but something closer to quiet determination. She told me that fabricated paternity tests were more common in bitter custody disputes than most people realized, and that there were specific, verifiable ways to prove a document had been falsified, if we were willing to fight for it. Eleanor explained that the laboratory listed on Julian's report was not accredited by any recognized regulatory body, a detail that had escaped my notice in my panic but that she spotted within minutes of reviewing the paperwork. She explained that legitimate paternity testing laboratories are required to follow strict chain-of-custody procedures, including witnessed sample collection and documented verification of identity, none of which appeared anywhere in Julian's report. She told me, gently but firmly, that we had a very strong chance of exposing the fraud, but that it would require me to do something I dreaded more than almost anything else in the world, undergo a legitimate, court-ordered DNA test myself, alongside Teddy, conducted through an accredited laboratory with proper chain-of-custody protocols, so that the truth could be established beyond any possible doubt. I remember the day Teddy and I went to the accredited testing facility, a plain, unremarkable medical building on the edge of town with fluorescent lights and stiff waiting room chairs. Teddy was 9 years old by then, and though we had tried to shield him from the worst of the custody battle, he was old enough to sense that something was wrong, that his parents' divorce had become something darker and more frightening than the ordinary sadness of two people no longer living in the same house. I told him, as gently as I could, that the doctors needed a small sample from inside his cheek to help sort out some grown-up paperwork, and that it wouldn't hurt at all. Teddy, brave in the particular way that children are brave when they trust the adult beside them completely, opened his mouth for the swab without complaint, and afterward asked if we could get ice cream on the way home, and I said yes, we absolutely could, because in that moment I needed something sweet and simple and good just as badly as he did. The wait for the results felt like the longest 3 weeks of my life. I went through the motions of my job at the law firm, I made Teddy's lunches and helped him with his homework and tucked him into bed each night, but underneath all of it ran a current of dread that never fully quieted. I kept imagining the worst version of events, some clerical error, some cruel twist of fate, some way that Julian's manufactured lie might somehow be validated by a system I had trusted my entire life to seek out the truth. Eleanor told me, during one of our phone calls in that anxious stretch of waiting, that fear like mine was natural, but that fear was not evidence, and that I needed to hold on to what I knew in my heart while the science caught up to confirm it. When the results finally arrived, Eleanor called me at work, and I stepped into an empty conference room to take the call, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She read the report to me slowly, word by word, and when she reached the line stating a 99.99% probability of paternity, confirming beyond any statistical doubt that Julian Ashcombe was indeed Teddy's biological father, I sat down on the conference room floor and cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry in months, great heaving sobs of relief and vindication and exhaustion all tangled together. I was not crying because I had ever doubted the truth. I was crying because the truth, finally, undeniably, existed on paper, in a form that a judge would have to acknowledge. But Eleanor was not finished, and neither was I. Proving that Teddy was Julian's biological son was only half the battle. We still needed to prove that Julian had knowingly fabricated a false document and submitted it to the court, because without exposing that deception, Julian's legal team could simply argue that the first test had been a laboratory error, an innocent mistake rather than a deliberate fraud, and Julian would walk away with nothing more than an apology while continuing to paint me, in the eyes of the court, as someone who had allowed a fraudulent narrative to spiral out of control. Eleanor hired a forensic document examiner named Walter Higgins, a quiet, meticulous man who had spent over 20 years testifying in court cases involving falsified records, and Walter began the painstaking work of tracing the so-called laboratory listed on Julian's report back to its source. What Walter discovered, over the course of several weeks, was more disturbing than I had imagined. The laboratory did not exist as a legitimate testing facility at all. It was a shell operation, a website with a professional-looking logo and a rented mailbox address, run by a man who had previously been sanctioned by a state medical board for falsifying documents in an entirely unrelated matter years earlier. Walter traced payment records, subpoenaed through Eleanor's legal channels, showing that Julian had paid for the fraudulent report using a credit card in his own name, a detail Julian had apparently never expected anyone to scrutinize closely enough to find. Walter also discovered, through careful digital forensic analysis, that the report's formatting contained inconsistencies typical of documents created using basic word processing software rather than the specialized laboratory reporting systems used by accredited facilities, inconsistencies invisible to an untrained eye but glaringly obvious to someone who had spent decades studying exactly this kind of fraud. While Walter built his case and Eleanor prepared our filings, I had to continue living an ordinary life, or at least the appearance of one, for Teddy's sake. This meant packing his lunch every morning with the crusts cut off his sandwich exactly the way he liked it, and sitting through parent-teacher conferences where his third-grade teacher told me, with evident affection, that Teddy was a kind and thoughtful boy who often gave his snacks away to classmates who had forgotten theirs. It meant driving him to soccer practice on Saturday mornings and cheering from the sidelines even when my mind was consumed with legal filings and forensic reports. It meant, more than anything, protecting Teddy from ever learning the full extent of what his father had tried to do, because whatever Julian had become, I did not want Teddy to grow up believing his father had never loved him at all. I wanted to preserve, for as long as I honestly could, the good memories Teddy had of building that treehouse with Julian's hands, of being read to sleep, of being carried on his father's shoulders through crowded fairgrounds. During this period, I leaned heavily on the people in our family and our community who refused to let me carry this burden entirely alone. My sister Genevieve came to stay with us on weekends, filling our kitchen with the smell of soup simmering on the stove and reminding me, in her steady, no-nonsense way, that I was stronger than I felt. My neighbor, a widow in her 70s named Margaret Doyle who had lived next door since before Teddy was born, began leaving small gifts on our porch, a jar of homemade jam, a hand-knitted scarf, a card with a simple note that read only, "You are not alone, dear." Margaret had raised 3 children of her own through a difficult divorce decades earlier, and something about her quiet, weathered kindness reminded me that other women had walked through fire like this before me and had come out the other side whole. These small acts of community, of people choosing to show up for me in ways large and small, became the scaffolding that held me upright during the months when I did not feel strong enough to hold myself upright alone. The custody hearing was scheduled for a bright, unusually warm morning in late autumn, the kind of day when the light through courthouse windows seemed almost gentle, at odds with the tension knotted in my stomach. I remember choosing my clothes carefully that morning, a simple navy dress, low heels, hair pulled back neatly, wanting to look like exactly what I was, a mother who had nothing to hide. Julian arrived at the courthouse with Priscilla Vane at his side and, to my surprise and quiet disgust, Vivian Caro seated in the gallery behind him, dressed as though she were attending a business luncheon rather than watching a man attempt to strip a mother of her son through fraud. Julian would not meet my eyes as we passed each other in the hallway outside the courtroom, and I remember thinking, in that strange, detached way you sometimes think during the worst moments of your life, that he looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, as though the confidence I had once found so magnetic had curdled into something brittle and desperate. The hearing began with Priscilla Vane presenting Julian's original claims, reading portions of the fraudulent paternity report aloud to the judge with a practiced, sober gravity, as though she genuinely believed the document was legitimate. I sat beside Eleanor, my hands folded tightly in my lap, forcing myself to breathe slowly, reminding myself silently that we had the truth on our side and that the truth, as my sister had told me months earlier, does not need permission to exist. When it was Eleanor's turn to respond, she rose calmly, walked to the podium, and began laying out, piece by methodical piece, the evidence Walter Higgins had assembled. She presented the accredited paternity test confirming Julian's biological relationship to Teddy beyond any statistical doubt. She presented Walter's forensic analysis exposing the fraudulent laboratory as a shell operation with no legitimate accreditation. She presented the payment records tracing the fraudulent report directly back to Julian's own credit card. And finally, she called Walter Higgins himself to the stand, where he explained, in patient, precise detail, exactly how he had uncovered each piece of the deception. I watched Julian's face throughout Walter's testimony, and I watched something in him break apart in real time, the confident mask slipping to reveal something closer to panic. Priscilla Vane's cross-examination grew increasingly strained as she tried, and failed, to poke holes in evidence that had been assembled with almost surgical precision. When the judge, a stern, silver-haired woman named Judge Constance Abernathy, finally addressed the courtroom, her voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over every person present. She stated, plainly and without softening the blow, that submitting fabricated evidence to a family court was not merely a moral failing but a serious legal offense, one that called into question every claim Julian's legal team had made throughout the proceedings. She granted me full legal custody of Teddy that same afternoon, with Julian retaining only limited, supervised visitation pending further review, and she referred the matter of the fraudulent document to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges. I want to pause here and tell you honestly that winning did not feel the way I expected it to feel. I had imagined, during the darkest nights of that long ordeal, that vindication would arrive like a triumphant burst of relief, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Instead, when Eleanor squeezed my hand and whispered that it was over, I felt mostly exhausted, hollowed out, aware that even though the truth had won, something precious had still been lost. Teddy would grow up knowing, eventually, some version of what his father had tried to do. The family we had once been, however imperfect, was gone permanently, replaced by something fractured that we would all have to learn to live within. Justice, I learned that day, does not always arrive wrapped in celebration. Sometimes it simply arrives as the quiet, necessary end of a nightmare, leaving you standing in the wreckage, grateful to still be standing at all. If this part of the story is resonating with you, I want to gently ask you to pause for a moment and leave a comment below about what this story means to you, perhaps a time in your own life when you had to fight for the truth against overwhelming odds, or a lesson about resilience that you carry with you. Your comments mean more to me and to our channel than you probably realize, and reading them reminds me why I keep sharing these stories in the first place. In the months following the hearing, I focused entirely on rebuilding a sense of normalcy and safety for Teddy. We stayed in the same house, the one with the garden and the oak tree treehouse, because I did not want to uproot him any further than he had already been uprooted by his parents' divorce. I enrolled him in an after-school art program that he had been asking to join for over a year, something small and joyful that felt like giving him back a piece of ordinary childhood that the custody battle had quietly stolen. I watched him slowly return to himself, laughing more easily, sleeping through the night without the nervous energy that had crept into him during the worst of the proceedings, though he never fully stopped asking, every so often, quiet questions about why his father wasn't around as much anymore. I made a decision, during this period, that surprised even me. Despite everything Julian had done, despite the fraud and the cruelty and the calculated attempt to erase me from Teddy's life, I chose not to poison Teddy's memory of his father entirely. When Teddy asked why his dad only saw him now with a supervisor present, I told him, in language gentle enough for a 9-year-old to hold on to without being crushed by it, that his father had made some very serious mistakes that hurt people, and that grown-ups sometimes have to face consequences for their choices the same way children do, but that none of it meant Teddy had done anything wrong, and none of it meant his father had never loved him. I did not tell him about the fraudulent DNA test. I did not tell him about Vivian Caro. Those were burdens that belonged to the adults who had created them, not to a child who deserved, as much as possible, to keep his innocence intact. Julian's criminal case moved slowly through the district attorney's office over the following year. He was ultimately charged with fraud and submission of falsified evidence, and though his lawyer negotiated a plea deal that spared him significant prison time, he was required to complete probation, pay substantial fines, and undergo court-mandated counseling. Vivian Caro, according to Margaret Doyle, who somehow always seemed to hear the neighborhood news before anyone else, ended her relationship with Julian not long after the scandal became public knowledge among their mutual colleagues at the real estate firm, apparently unwilling to remain tied to a man whose professional reputation had collapsed so publicly. Julian lost his position at the firm entirely, the partners unwilling to keep someone on staff whose name had appeared in local news coverage of a fraudulent custody scheme. I would like to tell you that I felt satisfaction watching Julian's life crumble in the aftermath, and there were certainly moments, in the rawest parts of my anger, when I did feel something like grim satisfaction. But more than anything, as the months passed and the sharpest edges of my pain began to soften, I found myself feeling something closer to a tired, complicated sadness. I had loved this man. I had built a family with him. And somewhere along the way, he had become someone willing to fabricate scientific evidence and manipulate a court system in order to punish me for the simple act of discovering his infidelity. I grieved, quietly and privately, for the version of Julian I had married, the man who cried real tears in a hospital delivery room, even as I remained clear-eyed about the man he had chosen to become. About 18 months after the custody hearing, Julian requested, through his lawyer, a meeting with Eleanor and me to discuss modifying the supervised visitation arrangement. I agreed to the meeting mostly because Teddy, now 11 and increasingly articulate about his own feelings, had told me he missed spending unsupervised time with his father, that he understood his dad had done something wrong but that he still loved him and wanted the chance to rebuild trust slowly. Sitting across from Julian in Eleanor's office that day, I saw a man who looked genuinely humbled in a way I had not witnessed since before our marriage began falling apart. He had completed his court-mandated counseling, and something in the process, whether genuine reflection or simply the shock of losing everything he valued, seemed to have cracked open a version of self-awareness he had not possessed before. Julian apologized to me that day, not the performative, self-serving apology I had half expected, but something quieter and more specific. He acknowledged, in detail, exactly what he had done and why it was so profoundly wrong, not just legally but morally, to use a fabricated document to try to strip me of my son. He told me that in the depths of his anger and his need to feel powerful again after I had discovered his affair, he had convinced himself that destroying my relationship with Teddy would somehow restore something he felt he had lost, and that it was only after losing his job, his relationship with Vivian, and very nearly his relationship with Teddy altogether, that he understood how badly he had miscalculated what actually mattered. I did not forgive him instantly, and I want to be honest with you about that, because forgiveness is not a switch that flips the moment someone says the right words. But I told him, that day, that I was willing to let him slowly rebuild a supervised, and eventually unsupervised, relationship with Teddy, provided he continued his counseling and proved through consistent action, rather than words, that he had genuinely changed. Over the following 2 years, Julian did exactly that. He attended every supervised visit without fail. He never missed a child support payment. He showed up to Teddy's school plays and soccer games, sitting quietly in the stands rather than making a spectacle of his presence, and slowly, incrementally, the court restored more of his unsupervised time as it became clear he was serious about repairing what he had broken. I watched Teddy's relationship with his father heal in fits and starts, the way real healing usually happens, not in one dramatic moment of reconciliation but in 1,000 small, ordinary Saturdays spent building model airplanes or walking through the park or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to understand fully myself. Fighting back against Julian's fraud was never really about revenge, though I would be lying if I said the thought of revenge never crossed my mind during the darkest weeks of that ordeal. Fighting back was about refusing to let a lie become the foundation of my son's future. It was about standing in a courtroom and insisting, with every piece of evidence I could gather, that the truth mattered, that my son's identity and my identity as his mother were not things that could be erased with a falsified piece of paper and a well-paid lawyer. And in fighting for that truth, I discovered a strength in myself I did not know existed, a resilience that had been there all along, waiting for a moment terrible enough to call it forward. I also learned, through Margaret Doyle's quiet kindness and my sister Genevieve's fierce loyalty, that we are never meant to carry these battles entirely alone. So many of us, when catastrophe strikes, instinctively want to hide our pain, to handle everything ourselves, to protect our pride even as our world falls apart. But it was the people who showed up for me, who sat with me in waiting rooms and brought soup to my kitchen and reminded me, on the days I could not remind myself, that I was not crazy and not alone, who ultimately gave me the strength to keep fighting when I felt like I had nothing left. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is that reaching out for help is not weakness. It is often the very thing that saves us. Teddy is 13 now, taller than me, his voice beginning to deepen in that strange, wonderful way that signals childhood slipping gradually into adolescence. He knows, in an age-appropriate way, most of what happened during those difficult years, because I ultimately decided, as he grew older and asked more pointed questions, that he deserved an honest account of his own history, delivered gently and without bitterness. He has forgiven his father, in the particular, uncomplicated way that children are often more capable of forgiveness than adults, and he has also developed, I think, a quiet but unmistakable respect for what I fought through to keep him safe. Last spring, on Mother's Day, he gave me a card he had made himself, decorated with a clumsy but heartfelt drawing of the oak tree in our backyard, and inside he had written simply that he was glad I never gave up on him, and that he hoped, someday, to be as brave as I had been. I share this story not to paint myself as some flawless hero, because I made plenty of mistakes along the way, moments of anger and despair that I am not proud of, nights when I questioned whether I had the strength to keep going. I share it because somewhere out there, someone watching this video right now might be sitting in their own kitchen, holding their own folded piece of paper, facing a lie so enormous it feels impossible to overcome. I want that person to know that the truth, however buried, however deliberately obscured, can be uncovered with enough patience, enough support, and enough refusal to give up. I want them to know that fighting back does not require becoming cruel or vengeful. It simply requires believing, with your whole heart, that you and your children deserve the truth, and being willing to do the hard, exhausting work of proving it. Before we close this story together, I want to ask you something. If you have ever had to fight for something you knew in your heart was true, even when the whole world seemed determined to make you doubt yourself, please leave a comment below and share a piece of that experience with our community. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find the courage to keep fighting their own battle. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Our family of viewers, the people who return again and again to sit with these stories of struggle and resilience, means more to me than words can fully capture, and it is because of your support that I am able to keep telling these stories at all. Looking back now, years removed from the worst of it, I understand that Julian's fraudulent DNA test was, in its own twisted way, the final desperate act of a man who had lost sight of what truly mattered. He believed, for a brief and terrible period, that winning meant destroying me, that reclaiming his sense of power meant erasing my place in our son's life entirely. What he could not have anticipated was that motherhood, real motherhood, forged in 3 in the morning feedings and scraped knees and 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays of care, is not something that can be dissolved by a fabricated laboratory report. It is written into a child's bones in a language no forgery can replicate. Teddy knew, even in his youngest and most frightened moments during that custody battle, that I was his mother, in every sense that mattered, and it was that unbreakable, wordless knowing between us that ultimately gave me the strength to fight until the truth caught up with what we had always known. Today, our house still has the garden, though I have expanded it considerably over the years, adding raised beds where Teddy and I grow tomatoes and sunflowers every summer. The treehouse Julian built still stands in the old oak tree, weathered now but sturdy, and Teddy still climbs up there sometimes on quiet afternoons, not because he needs to escape anything anymore, but simply because it is his, a piece of childhood that survived everything that tried to tear our family apart. I sit on the back porch on those afternoons, watching him up in the branches, and I think about how close I came to losing him to a lie, and how grateful I remain, every single day, that I found the strength to fight back, to insist on the truth, and to give my son a life built on honesty rather than fear. That, more than any courtroom victory or forensic report, is the ending I am most thankful for, and I hope, in sharing it with you today, that it gives you a little more hope for whatever battle you might be facing in your own life right now.